Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, Chuck. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining. I am Michelle Johnson, the Event Marketing Specialist at ProcessMaker. For those of you who are joining for the first time, this is part of a series, the Innovation in Banking series. The pandemic has accelerated plans for adoption of digital technologies in 2021, amplifying several key trends, notably the drive for digital transformation. The series is about the relevant topics around digital transformation and the technological innovation in banking driving it. In this webinar, we will discuss the strategies to getting the most of the technology solutions, adopting the business processes, and aligning the people in your organization to maximizing the transformed environment. Before we get things started, a little bit about us. ProcessMaker is an award winning, low code, no code solutions provider with a set of solutions focused on community banking and account opening. It is extremely rewarding to know that the meticulous development of tools and solutions that ProcessMaker has developed is recognized by those who serve us, such as Best Digital Process Automation Solution and Design Workflow Management System of the Year. Among the highlights in the numerous awards is easiest to use, easiest to set up, users most likely to recommend. In the first installment of the series, we discussed process automation with a focus on streamlining the account opening process. The constraints the pandemic placed around in person interactions heightened the need to have a digital account opening, which quickly became much more than a luxury. In the second installment, we explored integration of the various products from multiple vendors into a cohesive workflow. As financial institutions wrestle with their digital transformation strategies, they seek to acquire tools to fill in the gaps between their capabilities and their aspirations. Increasingly sophisticated technology is required to achieve a successful digital transformation. Unfortunately, most financial institutions seek to deliver on new demands by adding piecemeal elements to their existing operations without a strategic approach to the ecosystem, which leads us to today's installment of the Innovation in Banking series. Today, we focus on the change management. Digital transformation is inevitable, and the future community banking lies in appropriately leveraging technology. Respondents to a recent Gartner survey identified key drivers in their digital transformation initiatives. 69% digital acceleration, the adoption of the technologies that will deliver excellent customer service and provide competitive advantage. 60% operational excellence, 50% cost optimization. In the current environment of compressed net interest margins, finding ways to keep expenses down is even more important. Today's speaker is Chuck Wakocha. He leads the banking solutions team at ProcessMaker, and he is a thought leader, and he brings over 10 plus years of experience in fintech. Should you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A section below, and during Chuck's discussion, they will be answered following the event. Now I'd like to introduce you all to Chuck.
All right, appreciate it, Michelle. Thank you very much. Nice
You're
intro.
welcome.
And again, as we looked at where we're at, while we tend to often focus on technology related to digital transformation isn't just about the implementation of new tools. Transformation sits at the intersection of the people, process, and technology framework. And for those digital transformation strategies to work, a synchrony of the people, processes, and technology must take place. So the term change management often refers to the processes by which organizations undertake variations in their business processes in order to become innovative, to improve flexibility, and to more readily adapt to the constantly changing and evolving global marketplace. So, achieving the full potential of any transformation and giving organizations the power to transform their businesses with minimal disruption starts with the endpoint in mind, and that's driving profitable growth. So, in addition to getting the most out of existing and new technology solutions, the organizations, the financial institutions must gather or really try to seek organizational alignment while transforming their processes. And then, of course, implementing the tools and systems in order to achieve those sometimes difficult and high demands of what, competing in the marketplace. So when we think about that endpoint in mind, it's the same: driving profitable growth. And then we need to look at and understand what must be done to execute this. And to innovate for competitive advantage and to deliver exceptional customer service while doing so, we must make fundamental changes in how the business is conducted, our processes. And we must do this in an ever changing and challenging market environment. Obviously, while we're doing this, the marketplace is changing, our competitors are changing. So we must continue to adapt in doing so. And ultimately, always keeping in mind delivering the exceptional customer service. And in order to do so, we have to enable our staff with the right tools and the technology to execute that strategy. So when we think about that profitable growth, right, this is the end point. Walking backwards, how do we do that? We must innovate. And in order to innovate, we acquire the right tools and enable our staff to execute that. So those statistics that Michelle talked about, sitting at the cross section of people, processes, and technology, that is digital acceleration. That equals technology. The operational excellence equals process. The cost optimization, that is the people. Typically, we're thinking about managing overhead. The labor and the folks tend to be our biggest investment in our organization. So when you think about those three things, the digital acceleration, the operational excellence, and cost optimization, you're looking at the alignment of these three things. So in order to really achieve that excellence, it really comes down to creating and having an efficient and well balanced process, investing in our people, so managing our folks well, having well trained people that will execute this, and of course, having the right technology to move forward. The big takeaway in this is that these three things are very independent, right? It's symbiotic relationship, and changes to any of these components will necessitate changes in the other. To be successful in designing and executing effective strategy, all three need to be considered as to how they work together, how they are independent, right? And in thinking about that, there are three questions I think are very important to ask. Always ask yourself, your colleagues, the folks who are leading these changes, right? Again, whether I'm the initiator of these changes or the champion or a part of the process and the work streams that will be affected, right? If I change one, what happens to the other two? And what must change with the other two when I decide to realign one, right? And then probably the most important question to ask is, when I change any one of these three elements, what's the impact on our organization's customer experience? So, generally we tend to look at it obviously internally, but it does have a huge impact on our external and our customer experience. Again, if we're driving, thinking about that back end, walking back from the profitable growth, the customer experiencing, delighting our customers, and is an essential part of that. So, and when I continue to think about this, and I think we can all agree that the people are the most important of the three, right? But without the processes, people can't operate effectively. People need the tools and the technologies to be able to deliver those desired objectives that we've set, and then be able to deliver those efficiently at a high level. So again, if we rank them in order, it would be people, followed by the processes, followed by the tools. And again, as they're independent, you can have one and but not do well in the other, and will not achieve the success that you would like. But in terms of that order, right, our people, we can always acquire new tools, but the institutional knowledge are often that is instilled within our people really help us deliver and drive that culture. So the first important thing, like key considerations in the impact of this, right, is with the people, you must get the buy-in. I think about it sometimes, having been in organizations or at times where, from a top-down process, the decision has been made to do something, to change a process, to add technology without an understanding of how that will impact the people who are set to execute it. And often what happens then is you find resistance. folks are people are resistant to change, right? People are resistant to change, period. And especially in organizations where it can be uncomfortable. There's the anxiety that's raised in how does this affect me? How does this affect my performance? And even more deeper, how does this affect my job security, right? What does this mean for me? So making sure that you get the people buy-in is probably the most important thing, right? So first and foremost, change management depends on the people involved in the operation, and it requires getting them on the board. And along with that is communication. If this change isn't communicated effectively, it'll be hard to get that buy-in. And if it's not communicated with the right amount of time, the disconnect can occur, right? So it'll be hard to announce on Friday that we're going to undertake and go through changes and start next week. So preparing our folks for what this is, getting the right buy-in, and while there are quite a number of ways in organizations that um, specialize in managing or going through the change management, it's understanding these principles that are important. There are also plenty of books and things that you can go through to help you manage this appropriately. I remember when I was in business school, one of our major projects was managing the change, right? No matter what you're doing, managing the people is the most important part of it. And so that includes, obviously understanding who our folks are, alignment of skill sets, the design or the redesign of our culture, right? And the behaviors and the behavioral change that will go into this. So we can map out and think about the organizational change, which will ultimately change, right? If we're bringing in tools, if we're changing processes, who's responsible for what? Those things will adjust. But also, how we communicate that, how we realign those based on the skill sets, right? If we put the wrong people in the wrong places, that's going to create friction, right? If we are not training our people properly to undertake these new tools and to be able to harness them appropriately, that's going to create friction as well. So as you're managing the change and the rapid processes that go into that, recognizing, what this looks like in a bigger picture. Why are we even doing this, right? What is the business case for it? How are we competing in the market, right? It's how does this connect to our overall objectives? And then mapping out the necessary adjustments, within the company, right? The people, right? This will inevitably necessitate adjustment in our structure, right? And what folks are doing. And even, for some folks where they have, again, being resistant to change, I now have a tool that's making things a little bit easier. But the anxiety that creeps in because I start worrying about, if I'm actually needed anymore or on those things. So it's important to understand that. And then even as you go from, the reduction, typically, in the technology adoption, is the reduction of manual processes, right? But then it also means that I'll be taking on new roles or new, or new expected competencies. So it's important to be able to train our folks on what those changes are and how to be effective in that. And again, the bottom line, winning the support of our employees, getting that buy-in, right, is probably the most important part of it. The next step then is the process, right? So the people, process, technology. Again, we rank those: the people, the processes. I like to think about processes um, from a personal standpoint. I want to have robust and well thought out and defined processes enough that when I go on vacation, things are not going to fall apart. It seems counterintuitive that I want to structure this in a way that almost that it does make me expendable, right? From a process standpoint, this is how we do things. When we start, we do this and do this and do that, right? And so, ideally, I also think about this from my consulting days in succession planning, right? If I were to win the lottery, think tomorrow, right, or this Saturday, then what happens, right? Or if I was to get a promotion and move into a new role, we need to have the next person able to step in without a loss of heat, without any friction in moving through and driving that. And that's with the well thought out process. But it's important as you're changing this process that you manage the rollout, right? Don't kill the goldfish, right? If you And many kid has learned this lesson the hard way, trying to clean out the goldfish bowl, right? You change all the water, but that sudden change creates a shock to the system, right? And although the water may be cleaner, the fish hasn't had an opportunity to adjust to the new environment. So again, as you're training, as you gradually manage that rollout, communicating it properly. So making sure the right processes are in place to support these changes, these transformation. And in order for them to succeed, those activities to succeed, the right strategies must be put in place. Right? Obviously, again, in order for that to work well, you need to ensure that the team is prepared for the change taking place. And this strategy, of course, must be appropriate to your institution. Quite often I'll see folks who, whether they'll take um, a framework and say this is, we're just going to roll this out wholeheartedly. You have to consider this with respect to your institution. Having worked with many institutions, the way a $200 million bank operates and runs, the resources available, the roles and the division of labor is quite different with than an institution at 2 billion than one at 25 billion, right? So those things are important to understand and make sure that appropriately applied to your institution, you are making the necessary adjustments. And then, of course, time management is essential, right? That's on both ends, right? As you're mapping it out, you can't roll out these changes at the last minute and say, hey, this is what we're going to do. And you can't take too long either. You lose a lot of urgency, you lose a lot of competitiveness, right? If you're taking forever to roll out, it's easy for these things to fall off the wayside. It's easy for us to lose the urgency that's driving this change. It's easy for us to not take this as well as it could. And then, of course, always there's some of the holdouts in our system or in our processes who may try to derail this. So properly managing that from a time perspective is important. Again, if the rollout is too fast, like with the change in the goldfish, it creates a shock to the system and would kill it, right? So takeaways, right? Manage rollout, provide and map out the consistency, for your processes and procedures. Ultimately, in doing so, the objective is to be able to gain efficiency, eliminate errors, right? As you move from a manual process, it frees us up from the rote work to do actually the higher order work that which we're supposed to do instead of spending, too much of our time um, going through those things that could be eliminated through automation. Technology. The ultimate goal of technology is to empower our people, right? And so empowering our people in the process, and with the end goal in mind, um, in order to provide those necessary resources. Another way to think about this is you don't buy a tool first and then retrofit the people and the processes around it. You have to understand what that end goal is, the people that you have in mind, all right, your current, folks, what is needed to get them up to that, design the processes for what you're trying to accomplish, and then identify and define the tools that will help you accomplish that end goal. I remember when I played football, for example, there were certain schemes, for those who don't understand football well, pardon the analogy, but in that the schemes and the plays that you call have to be appropriate for the people who are going to execute it. For example, I'm not the biggest guy in the world. I played my career, standing at a outstanding 5'5" and some change, weighing about 170. I'm not the biggest guy who's going to run over people all the time, but I was extremely fast, right? So the tools, the schemes were those that would take advantage of my strengths while minimizing those, right? If we had another guy who was a much bigger but a little bit slower, the schemes that would be around that, the processes designed around that would be appropriate to the people. But again, we're talking about technology, right? So finding, once you've defined the processes, we know who our people are, then we define what technologies will be appropriate to execute that. And again, if you are the decision maker in this process and you were to acquire a great tool for your institution, but your people are not equipped to utilize it properly, you will not see the gains that you were hoping for. So, again, takeaway here is having great people without great tools, though, is like having persons walking while your competitors are driving. It's much harder to get where you're going. So when I think about this, the first thing that comes in is like, ooh, that's a nice shiny tool. But from a kid standpoint, a kid can't do anything with this. A toddler can't drive this, right? So no matter how shiny it is, it becomes something that sits in the garage, or collecting dust. And a lot of us have been around long enough to have acquired great solutions. However, because they were not well integrated, or we were not trained well, or not prepared organizationally to take on those tools, it was an overpriced and tool, because we were not able to leverage it at the level it was meant to be driven at. And then, of course, if you have someone who's just learning how to drive, right? Yeah, I'm excited too, but I still need training. All right, I can drive, but I still need the training and the refinement in order to be able to utilize this. So how does this apply to where we currently are, right? In this age of digital transformation, the challenges really involve incorporating all these things, siloed processes, siloed data, and the processes that have created friction and very frustrating. So in the incorporation of legacy systems and applications, right? So we have existing stuff that are already in place, and we're acquiring new technology into these as well. And we now have to map out how this fits into our processes, or redefine appropriately the processes that will best utilize these. So in the previous sessions, we talked about when we have the integration of legacy systems and new applications as well, what are the best practices in thinking about how we integrate those. And then the taking advantage of those tools means that we have to provide those or integrate those appropriately. So integrating and understanding what we have starts with mapping out what our current situation. A great tool or a great framework for that is current state assessment and gap analysis. Quite often, many institutions will bring in um, consultants to do this, or if it's internal, it really does require mapping out each process, right? Documenting every step and really taking a look at it to understand what we have in place. And as you do that, you find things that are somewhat outdated, right? Those things no longer apply. And definitely, even as we move forward, those things will no longer serve the purposes that initially where they were designed to, or will uncover a lot of workarounds that created efficiencies. So once we map those out, right, we will also see gaps between where we are and where we want to get to, right? Here we are, and here's our aspirational points. By understanding those gaps, we can then determine what needs to be done to fill in those. From a training of the people, right? It may be a skills related thing, right? Folks may not have the requisite skills to go there, or we often will have multiple people who are doing things way outside of the functions that they should be serving, right? And these have been a vestige of workarounds that have been created, right? So being able to realign folks with their skill sets, with their work streams, and then to gain those efficiencies, and of course in some of those gaps would be things that are best addressed with new tools. So when we think about the objective automation, it's to gain efficiencies. So, one of those, I guess, a way to translate that is, how do we reduce time in what we're doing? And how do we increase the value of the human resources, our folks, in what they're doing? Right. One of those, things previously talked about was in bringing in a loan origination system or an underwriting system, where before we had to manually key in all these things, go through Excels, being able to streamline that in a much more efficient process, that's what we want to gain. But if I'm bringing in new tools, I also have to teach people how to utilize it. So going back to this, right, start by documenting and mapping out all your processes. You will discover that there are a number of things that you weren't even thinking about, or even many cases for a lot of folks who were doing things that were essential and critical, but lacked the visibility because it was, it's part of the workaround. But then it will help us to improve those things and provide the right resources in the right places. Again, the training of the folks or the acquisition of the technology to do that. And then in part of that, something that's also not immediately thought about while you're doing that is while you understand what you're doing, we can define how we measure it, the analysis behind it. How will we assess, our success if we're not able to measure it, right? So if, for example, going back to the loan underwriting system, part of that will be the time it takes for us to complete a loan, right? With an addition of a new tool, it may have taken us, 30 to 45 days, from the start of the loan application to the endpoint to funding to loan approval. But with this, we can shrink that to 14 days. We can shrink that to 8 days, right? But that gives us a thing to measure, right? And that's how we will define success. So obviously, in that, we're able to process loans a lot faster, which also means we can process more loans, which obviously from that bottom line point, that end point, driving profitable growth, making loans faster is a huge part of what we're doing, right? So as we look at that, review the bank's processes, right, relative to everything that we're going to do. Review the people and the structures who are currently doing that, and then of course review the existing technology that's in place to manage that, and then look at what new technology will either supplant what we have to improve that or supplement, where we have gaps, right? So to be able to bring that in, and then of course, the managed rollout is important part of this. um, there are plenty of good sources to think about or to utilize when we are thinking about change management. One of my favorites there, again, some of these, you have to look at them from the overview, from the high level, the philosophical side of it. John Cotter's 8-step process for leading change is a great one. The change management model that consists of 4 stages is another one, right? Where you determine the need for change, you prepare and plan for that change, and then as you go into the implementation of change, you're able to then roll it out, and then post being able to sustain that change and again maximize the need for that change. So when I think about these things here on the bank side, I think about the people, processes, and technology, right? But there's a bit more on that from the bank side of it, right? There's policy, right? Even before the process, because the policy provides the same framework for our activities, right? It sets the, things like our underwriting standards, our credit decisions, which sets our processes. So even before you get to your processes, we have policies that we have to incorporate into this. And that even goes back to regulation and guidelines, staying compliant with all of those. So before you get, to what's determined the processes, look at what those policies are. Make sure that you're in compliance and that you're aligned with those. And then you establish the policies for the people who are going to be executing them. And again, the most important part of that, I think, is the people who are executing the processes. Those policies are no good if the people who are doing them are not doing a good job or not trained properly, right? You can have a great scheme, back to my football analogy. If you have a great scheme, but you don't have Tom Brady, you can have marginal success. But if you got a great, folks in there or they're trained well, you will take that and accelerate it to a championship level. Again, mind you guys, as a football guy, I'll use a lot of those analogies. And then, of course, then in the technology, right, the acquisition of the technology to execute those processes. And in conjunction with that technology, the training that's necessary to be able to push that through. So people, processes and technology, and the way it actually flows starts from a policy standpoint, the framework that defines this, the processes that are established as that, right? If we go look at our standard operating procedures, if we look at everything from that's documented, it should outline that. And then of course our people who will be executing those. And as we change each of these components, these things will change in accordance, right? The technology or the training that will go to that, and ultimately we will arrive at our decisions, for that. So I pulled this out as a way to look at the loan, process from specifically to a loan decision, but it's applicable to, to any process that we're looking at here. So I also wanted to, talk about, a few elements, with this. All right, the um, order in which these go into, or the way we approach it, can also create issues, and challenges that we could otherwise avoid, or things that tend to provide, reasons for failure in this, right? I mentioned at the very beginning, you got to get the buy-in. Sometimes the change is initiated by, our staff, our folks who are utilizing, poor tools or struggling in that. They're aware that sometimes the initiation is coming from the top down. Our leadership has identified new strategies or objectives that we're going to go forward with, or obviously for many of us, and more frequently, it's the marketplace that's telling us this is what we need to do. We need to innovate. So as we get that and determine that, we need to then drive inside internally to get the buy-in for all those affected. And again, there are different approaches to this, but importantly, start with organizationally. How will that change? Who are will the, in certain things here, if we're using this lending example, who will be most immediately affected, right? And going from that, and starting on a solution before the underlying problem that requires change is fully understood. That's a recipe for disaster, right? That does not lead to change. You have to understand the problem you're trying to fix. You don't go get that Ferrari without having, the person's ready, or knowing, what you have and the ability to execute it. Without understanding what problems you need to fix, you can't identify the solution. Often you hear the prescription without diagnosis is malpractice, right? So before you prescribe what the change is or what the solution will be for that, you need to diagnose and understand the problem you're trying to fix. And then again, understanding the people involved, and the styles that are involved. If you don't spend time systematically analyzing the folks, right, the skill sets, the changes that will incur, and the adjustments that will need to be made, that was another reason that will lead to failure. And of course, another area is validating the proposed solutions, right? There are lots of solutions out there, and there are some that are appropriate for your institution, and there are some that are not. That doesn't mean they're not great solutions, but understanding its fit for your solution, understanding your current ecosystem, right? How this will integrate with your current legacy systems, how will it integrate with other tools, how will it fit with the environment that you have. That's an important part of the process. Don't just go after the most shiny thing and the newest thing on the market there. And again, as you're rolling out the change, communicate what is happening and why, right? And if you don't, again, these are things that will lead to poor outcomes. Define measurable outcomes. Define milestones as you're going through that, right? As you get to mile marker, 8, as part of the 15 miles, you know what you've done, and by this point, this is where you should be. It helps you to understand. It helps our folks, manage this. Um, the biggest challenge as human beings from a behavioral standpoint to adjust to is uncertainty. We can adjust to a lot of structures. I mean, last year was probably one of those, right? And unprecedented environment for us in our time, right? In the pandemic environment, what was hard to do was manage uncertainty. We can deal, we're absolutely resilient in dealing with tough situations, but we really have a hard time with uncertainty. So managing that process, that managed rollout, defining the measurable outcome, so I can see, okay, we've accomplished this at this point, and this is what we need to get to the milestone, is appropriately. And then is important to appropriately deal with this. And then always, if you don't, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Be prepared for contingencies. That's always, a part of it. What happens when plan A doesn't work out? How do we adjust, and how do we prepare for that? I pulled out a analysis I did for an institution some time ago. Again, thinking about the loan life cycle as they were considering implementation of change. And what we did was map out each of these process and then highlight areas that would create challenges or gaps in this. So in this process, the initial starting point for them, again, moving from a very manual process to a digital transformation, it was looking at what was going on and how do we currently do that. So for example, the business development officers, the lenders, were out there building relationships with their customers or prospectives, and this is how they would identify who prospective borrowers would be. Now you think about how that would change now, years later, where digital marketing is a huge part of it. Or if we're adding a digital a loan origination or account opening process, right? The impact of the BDO will be significantly reduced when someone can go directly to my website and start the process without me as a BDO initiating that, right? So then the digital marketing, the structures that we put in place, the resources that we put on those would have to change, right? So the points of initial contact may no longer be the business networking event. It may be a an ad on Instagram or on Facebook or somewhere else, right? Or how we provide those. And so as we look at each of those, the allocated resources or the time to each of these would need to change, right? The tools that we implement for our CRM would now need to be more robust than what the BDO's book of business was. Then we look at the loan origination, right? Again, it used to be the BDOs would go in and gather all the information, provide a packet. Here's the paper loan application, or even borrowers, prospective borrowers will go on the website and download the appropriate sheets and the forms and the intake forms and then return those and submit those. Now with the digital application, I can streamline that entire process. I can upload the docs and all those. So who was involved and who was accomplishing what has fundamentally changed. And if we continue in that into the underwriting process, again, I'm highlighting these to really show that in order to really understand this, you have to map it out point by point. And in the underwriting process, there was a lot of gaps in there. The touch point of a client, of a borrower, generally involved at least five people, sometimes six, depending on where it is, the BDO, accounting folks, right? The service managers, underwriters. And at times, what needed to be communicated was often missed. And this was just by improving some of these gaps, the reduction of the loan application process went from 45 days on average to 21 days. And then once we implemented the technology to it, it reduced it to 7 days. And for a business owner, and myself being one, that's a huge part of it. I don't have the luxury to wait 45 days for the cash that I need to operate my business or to start my business. And also competitively, if this institution is taking that long, I will be at another institution driving that relationship. So then, of course, moving on from there, in the after the loan has been dispersed and gone through, the expected management of the relationship, the ongoing part of it, the cross-sell opportunities, the remarketing opportunities, the additional points of engagement that we will have, as an institution with these. And again, this is a pared down visual version of what was essentially a 65-page document that mapped out all of these and detailed each of these processes, where we would go into each area and expand upon that. So as we're moving into this last page here, this is time to take questions, right? So from a an understanding of the importance of, where do we start, right? How do we go through this? What are the key things to manage? All right. So as we wrap up here, we got a couple more minutes, but one of the things to consider with effective change management is regulations are changing, right? They're constantly changing. In evaluating them and understanding how they will affect the bank's process and make those changes accordingly, right? So that's where it starts. If you recall it in that map here, those are the things that ultimately would determine what processes will change or need to change, right? Policy and regulations, our regulators will often tell us that probably in the last few years, the uh, implementation of the CISO guidance, even as it's been affected by the pandemic, that's a huge change to our processes. Working with a number of institutions on their allowance processes, right? Uh, uh, the changes precipitated by CISO required the management of huge amounts of data, right? Which prompted tools and the technology in order to do it. Trying to get that done with Excel or a manual process was just not going to work. So now we are looking at that. And often when you think about the changes with CISO, it involved creating a cross-functional team, right? And all the folks that will be involved in that process. So we had to remap the entire process. And of course, back to that initial portion of the current state assessment and gap analysis. And then from there, we're able to find where those points are and what tools we needed to bring into place and by whom, right? Which tool provider, evaluating those appropriately. So now, if I'm looking at tools, right, we got our great sales guys in front of us and saying my tool is the best and my tool is the best. If you don't know what solutions are going to address your challenges, it's hard to distinguish between those two to which will be appropriate for you, right? So understanding and thoroughly understanding your current situation will then help you effectively um, evaluate the appropriate tool. And again, those tools are it's not about the tool, it's about how the tool approaches that. An analogy going back to the car is, do I need that Ferrari or do I need a pickup truck, right? If I need to cut something, do I need a knife or do I need a pizza slicer or a chainsaw, right? They will all cut something, but I need to know what problems I'm trying to solve.
Well, Chuck, thank you so much. That was a very informative presentation you gave today. That was really great. And thank you all for connecting with us today. We hope you will join us again next month on November 18th for our next webinar. We will be discussing how pay as you go services such as Square, Cash App, and Chime are changing banking. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.